This is the final article in a 3-part series about how level, enemy, and AI design can make melee combat systems more engaging. These articles discuss several major titles and feature input from leading combat designers. The games analyzed for this article series are Devil May Cry, God of War 3, Bayonetta, Ninja Gaiden 2, Ninja Gaiden 3, Batman, Arkham City, Enslaved, Odyssey to the West, Assassinâs Creed 3, and Prince of Persia, Sands of Time. These titles were chosen to represent a selection of titles that span over a decade of combat design, commercial success, and middle ground of expectation for players' experience levels. For example, Assassinâs Creed 3 aims at an audience that has a solid understanding of gameplay mechanics, but does not present a high level of difficulty, whereas Ninja Gaiden 3 has similarly high expectations of player performance to the Dark Souls Demon Souls games. The Souls games and the recent Bloodborne represent an unusually extreme set of player expectations, and as such are not a reference point for this series of articles. But I may write about them in future in comparison to the principles seen in the selected titles. The professionals I interviewed and their main titles are Alex Sulman, who was involved with combat design on Heavenly Sword, God of War 3, and God of War Ascension. Rahni Tucker, the combat designer for Devil May Cry. Anthony Newman, the main combat designer on The Last of Us. Ben Ruiz, a combat design consultant and designer of Aztez. Daniel Nordlander, who worked on the combat of Dead Island 2. Walker, the systems designer on multiple Killzone games and responsible for designing the brutal melee system. Berendine Venemans, a designer on Killzone, Shadowfall, and Watchdogs. And Bart, who worked as a programmer on the Overlord series. In the first article, I went into depth on level design for melee combat systems, added here. In the second article, I went into depth about the enemy design and enemy AI, read here. In this article, I will compare which of the two has the most impact on melee combat, and how the contribution of level design to the engagement of the combat system can be increased. Based on the interviews that I have conducted, I believe that the games industry currently values enemies as being more important for good melee combat than level design, as demonstrated by the examples in the previous articles. Melee combat systems are mostly affected by enemy design and AI, and level design has less impact on the combat. That does not mean level design is not important for good combat, as bad level design can still ruin an otherwise good encounter. The purpose of enemies is to challenge the player and make the various attack options viable to use in different situations. Combat is essentially an interaction between the player and the enemies. Bird Overlord Enemies challenge the player's mastery of the combat system. Melee combat systems are designed to give players different ways to deal with various enemies. Level design does not challenge a player's mastery of the combat system. As a result of these priorities, levels are usually designed as empty rooms to give enough space for the fight and maneuvering around without interfering with the core combat activity. Even if you aren't integrating level design mechanics into the combat system, you still need airtight enemies, no matter what kind of game it is. That needs to be really good. Ben Ruiz Aztez. For all games researched the melee combat system would still work well and be fun in a completely empty space, which is often the essence of the level design surrounding them. However, the level design would often not be especially interesting without diverse combat encounters to add variety to their traversal. You can have really good melee combat on a flat plane. Walker Killzone. Games like Dam and Bayonetta often contain challenges wherein the player has to complete a combat-related objective. G. Defeating all enemies while in the air, in a large empty arena. This also reflects the history of the genre where two characters fighting in a blank dojo space was the early focus. G. Karate Champ, which they moved to scrolling, mostly flat arenas. G. Golden Axe and Double Dragon. It was the advent of 32-bit computers and consoles that allowed worlds to become more complex, moving the focus of melee combat games away from solely fighting towards also including traversal challenges. G. Medieval enemy design is more reusable than level design. Various enemy types usually keep returning, being encountered by the player in different group compositions as well as the same group compositions returning. Additionally, enemy eye is applicable to the entire game, and can even be reused for other projects. Level design, and particularly the associated artwork that complements it, varies throughout the game, and this requires more attention for each new combat encounter. Usually areas where the player fights enemies are, in terms of their collision boundaries, empty rooms of various sizes, which are dressed with models outside the bounding box, do not obstruct player or enemy movement. These areas are cheap to create, as they require less attention from a combat design point of view, and so the core activities of the player are more predictable and require less testing to ensure a consistent experience. The degree to which levels can be reused depends on the overall game, but in many adventure melee combat games, the changing scenes in which combat takes place is one of the appealing aspects for player progression. Alongside the escalation of complexity of combat, the playable space of the level design will likely remain very similar between encounters, but the dressing will often change considerably. Level design can enhance the combat experience and contribute a lot to a fight being fun. Placing interesting and complex combinations of enemies in a simple arena can result in memorable combat experiences. Equally, placing simple enemies in an interesting level layout makes that encounter memorable. Because of the level design, both can result in interesting fights, either based on the space or the enemies. Ideally, games would be created with synergy between the two, where the important aspects of both regularly contributes to amazing fight sequences. Far more handcrafted, or any war games such as God of War, level design and enemies can be equally important at different times. In open-world games it becomes more difficult to control the enemy's position and player's entry point. A combat system needs level design to show off the best side of the enemy design. Backmixing or placement in a better unit can easily break an otherwise great enemy. With regard to a melee combat system, the enemies tend to be more important, but it depends on the game. Rahni Tucker DmC. Some gameplay systems, such as stealth, require good level design. A classic form of stealth, such as hiding behind objects, does not work in an empty space. This is seen more in games which include ranged combat or other mechanics than in games which only focus on melee combat. Shooting also relies heavily on level design, as cover and line of sight blockers make the shooting interesting. Other traversal mechanics within the game also rely on the level design to be fun, and the mix between these in games, such as the Uncharted series, can be a significant part of their appeal. As Rahni Tucker argues, it varies between games whether the level design or enemies are more important for the game to be fun as a whole. Using the above research and the interviews, Several opportunities are available to improve the impact of level design on the combat. These methods are all intended as systems which can be used throughout the entire game instead of as a single set piece. When first encountered within the game, they can be tutorialized to teach the system to the player. It is also very important to keep the style of game you are making in mind, as these methods might not fit every game, every main character. When they are implemented as systems available throughout play, instead of individual set pieces, interactions with the level's geometry can become a complementary option for the player to use. When used, these mechanics can be gameplay highlights because players will often feel that they have triggered an uncommon or unique event that they have figured out themselves. The first method of using level design to diversify a player's combat experience is to give the player character attacks, which require certain pieces of the environment to be triggered. These attacks require a specific feature from the environment to be used, such as an attack which swings around a pillar while sliding down a slope,